Hey everyone. This is the third part in my series on Obama's foreign policy with regards to Russia. If you haven't seen the first two parts, I do obviously recommend them. Part 1 covered events prior to Obama, and Part 2 covered his attempts at bilateral cooperation with the Russian Federation. This time, we'll be covering events in Syria. Now, Syria had been ruled by Bashar al-Assad since the early 2000s. Starting in 2011, the country was racked by civil protests, government repression, civil war, invasion, mass immigration, really just privation and destruction on a catastrophic scale. This isn't an in-depth narrative of that conflict. Instead, we're going to be outlining the basic events, then focus our attention on how the US and Russia reacted to and tried to influence the outcome of those events. At the end of the video, we'll tie everything back together to the Russia reset and see if the two countries managed more cooperation than competition here. As always, a text version of the video with citations and sources will be linked in the description. Although Peter and Bill here were able research assistants, I alone shoulder the blame for most mistakes. If you disagree with something, definitely feel free to help me out by commenting so. It feeds the algorithm. Satiate my intellectual curiosity by posting sources to back up your snide comment. Okay, here we go.
Now, Mr. Spock.
Section 1. War begins. In March 2011, the Arab Spring, that wave of political protest and upheaval, which began months earlier in Tunisia, arrived in Bashar al-Assad's Syria. Recent developments in that country, population increases, a severe drought and resulting water crisis, the impoverishment of the many, and the enrichment of the few, resulting from a decade of economic privatization and liberalization, had created a large population of disenchanted Syrians, particularly in the countryside and on the fringes of its major cities. The Arab Spring became an outlet for public expression of this discontent. When anti-government protests erupted, officials responded with force and repression. Assad justified the use of force by painting the protesters as Sunni extremists akin to al-Qaeda, and as part of a foreign conspiracy to oust his government from power. Whether true or not in the beginning, it soon became a self-fulfilling prophecy, as Sunni jihadists did flock to Syria to fight against Assad's government, and powers, both great and regional, poured money and equipment and influence into the country. In May 2011, months after the protests began, the Obama administration announced personal sanctions against Assad and several senior members of his regime. Days later, Obama gave a speech where, after months of U.S. equivocation, he painted a broad picture of the U.S. response to the Arab Spring, starting with a brief defense of why events in the Middle East should still be relevant to the American people, and then linking those events to liberation movements in American history.
Countries may be a great distance from our shores. We know that our own future is bound to this region by the forces of economics and security, by history, and by faith. Today I want to talk about this change, the forces that are driving it, and how we can respond in a way that advances our values and strengthens our security. There are times in the course of history when the actions of ordinary citizens spark movements for change because they speak to a longing for freedom that has been building up for years. In America, think of the defiance of those patriots in Boston who refused to pay taxes to a king, or the dignity of Rosa Parks as she sat courageously in her seat. So it was in Tunisia, as that vendor's act of desperation tapped into the frustration felt throughout the country.
He then paused to remind his audience what the traditional role of the United States has been in the Middle East over the last couple of decades.
For decades, the United States has pursued a set of core interests in the region: countering terrorism and stopping the spread of nuclear weapons, securing the free flow of commerce and safeguarding the security of the region, standing up for Israel's security, and pursuing Arab-Israeli peace. We will continue to do these things with the firm belief that America's interests are not hostile to people's hopes. They're essential to them.
With this framework and context established, he then runs down a list of Middle Eastern countries that have experienced turmoil or tumult over the last couple of years and months. Let's pay close attention to who he singles out and why.
While Libya has faced violence on the greatest scale, it's not the only place where leaders have turned to repression to remain in power. Most recently, the Syrian regime has chosen the path of murder and the mass arrests of its citizens. The United States has condemned these actions, and working with the international community, we have stepped up our sanctions on the Syrian regime, including sanctions announced yesterday on President Assad and those around him. The Syrian people have shown their courage in demanding a transition to democracy. President Assad now has a choice. He can lead that transition or get out of the way. The Syrian government must stop shooting demonstrators and allow peaceful protests. It must release political prisoners and stop unjust arrests. It must allow human rights monitors to have access to cities like Daraa and start a serious dialogue to advance a democratic transition. Otherwise, President Assad and his regime will continue to be challenged from within and will continue to be isolated abroad. So far, Syria has followed its Iranian ally, seeking assistance from Tehran in the tactics of suppression. And this speaks to the hypocrisy of the Iranian regime, which says it stands for the rights of protesters abroad, yet represses its own people at home. Let's remember that the first peaceful protests in the region were in the streets of Tehran, where the government brutalized women and men and threw innocent people into jail. And we will continue to insist that the Iranian people deserve their universal rights and a government that does not smother their aspirations. But if America is to be credible, we must acknowledge that at times our friends in the region have not all reacted to the demands for consistent change with change that's consistent with the principles that I've outlined today. That's true in Yemen, where President Saleh needs to follow through on his commitment to transfer power. And that's true today in Bahrain. Bahrain is a long-standing partner, and we are committed to its security. We recognize that Iran has tried to take advantage of the turmoil there, and that the Bahraini government has a legitimate interest in the rule of law. Nevertheless, we have insisted both publicly and privately that mass arrests and brute force are at odds with the universal rights of Bahrain's citizens. In Iraq, we see the promise of a multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian democracy. The Iraqi people have rejected the perils of political violence in favor of a democratic process, even as they've taken full responsibility for their own security. Of course, like all new democracies, they will face setbacks, but Iraq is poised to play a key role in the region if it continues its peaceful progress. And as they do, we will be proud to stand with them as a steadfast partner. So in the months ahead, America must use all our influence to encourage reform in the region.
Libya, Syria, Iran, Yemen, Bahrain, Iraq, but no mention of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, even Israel, the most important regional allies of the United States, and each with their own well-known and well-documented violations of human rights. A curious omission indeed. While Syria was only mentioned briefly, Obama did call on Assad either to lead a legitimate reform effort or step out of the way. Since Assad proclaimed the majority of the protesters to be illegitimate, he was not likely to usher in a fundamental reform of Syria's government. And he considered his modest reform proposals and attempts at dialogue to be good enough. Thus, Obama's words probably fed into Assad's notion of a foreign conspiracy to oust him from power. Not an unreasonable fear, as the U.S. has a long history of removing governments and leaders it does not find preferable. With Assad ignoring Western protestations in favor of continued repression, the protesters hardened into several armed factions, united in their hatred of Assad but unable to agree on what would take his place. In July, Syrian army defectors formed the Free Syrian Army, or FSA. Though initially created to protect peaceful demonstrators, the FSA soon broadened its political imagination, ultimately seeking as its sole political objective the removal of Assad from power. The FSA was opposed within opposition ranks by radical Salafi groups like Ahrar al-Sham, formed in December 2011, which sought to replace Assad with an Islamist government. In the wake of escalating violence came more direct calls in the West for Assad to give up power. In August, President Obama announced harsher sanctions, especially on Syrian petroleum, and called for Assad to step down. His words echoed by Western allies and some local Arab powers. Although he faced a growing international backlash, Assad was not completely isolated. Russia remained his chief patron, shielding Syria from UN-backed action via the judicious use of its Security Council veto. In the face of international paralysis, thousands of Syrians had already perished, and by the end of the year, the country descended into civil war. Over the coming years, multiple overlapping campaigns would come to comprise this conflict. The original fight between government and opposition forces, the fighting that erupted between the Islamic State, or ISIS, and anti-ISIS forces, some for and some against Assad, and the Turkish operations against Syrian Kurds. The overlapping loyalties, conflicting goals, and multiple vectors of conflict complicated the war, making intervention a tricky prospect indeed. Regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Turkey backed opposition forces, although not always the same forces. Iran backed Assad. Among the larger powers, Russia unambiguously backed Assad, for Syria was a decades-long ally that, critically, leased the naval base at Tartus to Russia, the only Russian naval base on the Mediterranean Sea. The U.S., on the other hand, wanted Assad gone. Having had little success in brokering peace, the UN and Arab League sought to enlist the international powers in support of a political settlement to the conflict. In June 2012, an international conference organized by the UN produced the Geneva Communique and a roadmap for negotiations to establish a transitional government for Syria. The US and Russia proved unable to agree on whether Assad would be included in a future Syrian government, and this ambiguity scuttled the effort. Fighting continued, with rebel victories in the summer, but stalemate by year's end. Section 2.
The Thin Red Line.
By early 2013, the Civil War had devolved into a meat grinder. Aloof from the carnage and chaos stood the United States. Though a longtime foe of Ba'athist Syria, the most circumspect of U.S. policymakers, which included the president, remained chastened by their recent experiences in the Middle East, and thus reticent to involve U.S. troops and resources recklessly. Back in March 2011, Obama had directly cited Iraq as a cautionary tale of the foolhardy use of military power. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton also dismissed the possibility of direct U.S. military intervention, citing a lack of Syrian desire for such action.
Understand the strong desire of the Syrian people that no foreign country should intervene in their struggle. and we respect their wishes.
Policymakers were also wary of giving military support to anti-Assad rebels, only to inadvertently give succor to terrorist groups. But these same politicians had recently rejoiced at the death of Osama bin Laden and the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya. Perhaps if done correctly, the U.S. could intervene after all. But Syria was not Libya. Although his army was demoralized and disarrayed, Assad was much more heavily armed than Gaddafi had been, with access to both large storehouses of chemical weapons and modern air defense systems. He also possessed more domestic support than Gaddafi had enjoyed, and benefited from the disorganized opposition, whose diffuse members spent as much time arguing with each other as they did fighting Assad. In the face of these obstacles, U.S. leadership debated continuously over the course of 2011 and 2012, trying to figure out how best to shape events in their interest. Panetta, Petraeus, and Clinton supported large increases in military aid to rebel groups, arguing that lack of weapons was hampering their fighting strength. But, argued top brass in the military, it would require a massive commitment in order to surmount Assad's defenses and establish a no-fly zone. Moreover, the rebels were divided and tainted by Islamist factions hostile to U.S. interests, making it incredibly risky to send them large quantities of arms and ammunition. As even the hawkish Clinton admitted, quote, "The story of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan remained a powerful cautionary tale never far from anyone's mind." The situation was further complicated by the fact that Assad benefited from his status as a Russian client. So, while many U.S. talking heads of both political parties called for something to be done, no easy answer presented itself, and there seemed little stomach among U.S. politicians or the electorate for a large-scale military intervention into the country. Amid U.S. inaction, the various factions received money and weapons from other sources, and the fighting continued apace. More alarming than the conventional violence was the scourge of chemical weapons. Throughout 2012, evidence had slowly accumulated that Assad's forces were using chemical weapons, deploying them in an effort to salvage an increasingly dire military situation, to make up for troop desertions and things like that. On August 20th, 2012, Obama made a spontaneous yet significant statement during a press conference.
At this point, not ordered military engagement in the situation, but the point that you made about chemical and biological weapons is critical. That's an issue that doesn't just concern Syria, it concerns our close allies in the region, including Israel. It concerns us. We cannot have a situation where chemical or biological weapons are falling into the hands of the wrong people. We have been very clear to the Assad regime, but also to other players on the ground, that a red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus.
366 days later, a suspected chemical weapons attack occurred in the suburbs of Damascus, killing hundreds. While Assad denied that his forces had used chemical agents, the evidence was strong enough that the Obama administration finally felt compelled to respond. Given his red line pronouncement the previous year, many presumed that the president would engage in some sort of military response. The concentrated use of U.S. troops, perhaps in the mold of Desert Storm, would ensure that Assad's weapons were found and destroyed, and it's possible that in a vacuum and without the costly examples of Afghanistan and Iraq still smoldering in the background, Obama might seriously have considered this option. He was no pacifist. Although Obama did not run for office to be a war president, a leader defined by the gleam of his saber and the smell of gunpowder in his wake, Obama's 2008 campaign did stress again and again that U.S. security mattered, that terrorism needed to be fought, that Afghanistan was a good war that needed to be won. Once in office, Obama and his administration argued and feuded over the surge in Afghanistan and the drawdown in Iraq, but ultimately, this liberal president and his predominantly liberal cabinet massively increased the depth of the U.S. campaign in Afghanistan, as well as the breadth of the drone campaign across the greater Middle East. Over the course of his second term, Obama would oversee the drastic expansion of the war on terror across the African continent as well. But these military operations were, except for Afghanistan, unconventional. Special operations, drone strikes, cruise missiles, local proxies. The Pentagon argued that in order to be effective, a deployment to Syria would require nearly as many troops as the U.S. deployed to Afghanistan. Since regime change was also official U.S. policy at this point, it also meant that the U.S. would be required to take on the responsibility of either reforming or replacing Assad. All of that risked a thorny confrontation with Russia. That left airstrikes, which were not likely to stop Assad's chemical attacks in any event, and/or increased material support for rebel groups, hampered by the polyglot composition of the opposition. Neither option was as dramatic or climactic or cinematic as many had envisioned when Obama demarcated his chemical Rubicon, but then no one seemed to agree on what the U.S. should do, only that it had to do something. But even airstrikes were not without political and military risk. Understandably, Obama did not want to shoulder the blame for possible escalation by himself, so he reached out to Congress. On August 31st, he announced that he had asked Congress to debate the matter and vote on authorizing a military intervention in Syria.
Now, this attack is an assault on human dignity. It also presents a serious danger to our national security. It risks making a mockery of the global prohibition on the use of chemical weapons. It endangers our friends and our partners along Syria's borders, including Israel, Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, and Iraq. It could lead to escalating use of chemical weapons, or their proliferation to terrorist groups who would do our people harm. In a world with many dangers, this menace must be confronted. Now, after careful deliberation, I have decided that the United States should take military action against Syrian regime targets. This would not be an open-ended intervention. We would not put boots on the ground. Instead, our action would be designed to be limited in duration and scope. But I'm confident we can hold the Assad regime accountable for their use of chemical weapons, deter this kind of behavior, and degrade their capacity to carry it out. I'm confident in the case our government has made without waiting for UN inspectors. I'm comfortable going forward without the approval of a United Nations Security Council that so far has been completely paralyzed and unwilling to hold Assad accountable. Yet while I believe I have the authority to carry out this military action without specific congressional authorization, I know that the country will be stronger if we take this course, and our actions will be even more effective. We should have this debate because the issues are too big for business as usual. Make no mistake, this has implications beyond chemical warfare. If we won't enforce accountability in the face of this heinous act, what does it say about our resolve to stand up to others who flout fundamental international rules? To governments who would choose to build nuclear arms? To terrorists who would spread biological weapons? To armies who carry out genocide? We cannot raise our children in a world where we will not follow through on the things we say, the accords we sign, the values that define us.
Having outlined the why and the what, Obama ends his speech with an articulation of the liberal world order led by the United States that echoes the language Clinton employed in the first days of the post-Cold War era.
But we are the United States of America. And we cannot and must not turn a blind eye to what happened in Damascus. Out of the ashes of World War, we built an international order and enforced the rules that gave it meaning. And we did so because we believe that the rights of individuals to live in peace and dignity depends on the responsibilities of nations. We aren't perfect, but this nation, more than any other, has been willing to meet those responsibilities.
Obama is using much the same language that Clinton used when arguing for intervention in Yugoslavia, or that W. Bush used when arguing for intervention in Iraq. The U.S. has a responsibility to lead and act on the world stage. That Obama thought he could authorize military action in Syria without congressional approval is a legacy of the long and persistent increase in presidential power after World War II, especially under his predecessor, George W. Bush, who viewed presidential war powers as practically unlimited. That Obama calculated that it would be wise to involve Congress reflected the recognition that even a legally correct presidential action might not be prudent after a decade of war. Critics said this gave Obama an easy out, for he could blame Republican intractability for what was, at base, a lack of presidential resolve. Supporters countered that this was a welcomed return to a more balanced federal government, one where the chief executive no longer acted as if it had sole and complete authority in the realm of foreign affairs. As is often, but not always the case, two extremes both had a point. Obama was passing the buck on to Congress because he did not want to make a controversial military decision and understood the political power of having the legislature support military action. And while his going to Congress did speak to something of a more restrained interpretation of presidential power, his speech made clear that fundamentally he thought he legally had the ability to do this without Congress, and this was almost more of a courtesy. At any rate, while direct U.S. military action lost itself in a labyrinth of congressional debate and opposition forces benefited from a slowly increasing supply of arms and equipment, Assad was denuded of chemical weapons through diplomatic means. Seeing an opportunity to play the part of magnanimous power broker, Russian officials approached their U.S. counterparts, saying that they might be able to use their influence over Assad to convince him to give up his chemical weapons. On September 14th, Russia, Syria, and the U.S. agreed to place all of Syria's chemical weapons under international control. This arrangement was carried out, and all declared chemical weapons were removed from Syria by June 2014. The undeclared chemical weapons that likely remained in Assad's arsenal, and the reconstitution of at least some of his chemical weapons capabilities in the wake of further fighting in the years ahead, marred this achievement, making it, at best, a partial victory. Meanwhile, circumstances were shifting in ways that would allow Obama to use the U.S. military without additional congressional say-so. Throughout 2013, jihadist forces were consolidating power and support among opposition groups in Syria, most notably under the leadership of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, hitherto leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq. His Syrian and Iraqi forces combined into ISIS, the Islamic State, which achieved stunning victories in both countries throughout 2014. Although they originated in Syria, ISIS clearly threatened the US-backed government of Iraq. Therefore, the emergence of this new power in the region pushed Obama to escalate in turn, and this meant more guns for rebels and more planes over Syria. Still wary of the risks involved in arming Syrian rebels, Obama's administration stressed that every effort would be made to ensure that weapons only went to vetted, moderate rebels, and the first batch of 5,400 fighters were soon trained and equipped. But as is so often the case with allies and proxy forces, just because these soldiers benefited from U.S. support did not mean they aligned with U.S. aims. So, when they were ordered to fight ISIS rather than Assad, many of these anti-Assad opposition fighters opted instead to join al-Qaeda-affiliated groups like al-Nusra because they focused their martial powers against the entity the soldiers actually wanted to fight, the Syrian government. In addition to sometimes unreliable allies, the U.S. and a coalition of European and Middle Eastern states brought air power to bear against ISIS. Aerial bombardment began in Iraq, where the U.S. had the most at stake, but on September 23rd, the United States and a coalition of Arab states expanded the air campaign to strike ISIS targets in Syria. U.S. attention, however, remained squarely in the Iraqi theater of operations, where the Obama team was committed to propping up a client state. U.S. and Iraqi efforts eventually quashed most ISIS fighters in Iraq by the end of 2016. In Syria, ISIS remained a problem primarily for Assad, Turkey, and Russia. Section 3. Direct Russian Involvement. In part 1 of this video series, we delved into the weakness, or perhaps passivity, of Russian foreign policy in the 1990s, especially when it came to places like Yugoslavia. In the Middle East, this same phenomenon manifested itself in a drawing back of Soviet and then Russian activity in the region. Non-intervention became the modus operandi for the next 15 years. We then covered the perceived humiliations Russia's leadership felt as their priorities and demands were ignored by Western leaders, and mentioned Moscow's desire to partner with the U.S. in the global war on terror, a desire that clashed with the Bush administration's conception of Russia as an auxiliary rather than a co-equal. In Part 2, we discussed how assertive and anti-Western Putin's Russia had grown after maybe 2005, seeking to reaffirm Russia's status outside the hegemony of the liberal system controlled by the United States. In the context of the Middle East, this reassertiveness is most clearly shown by the renewed relationship between Assad and Putin, who drew closer together during this time. In 2005, Assad allowed Russia to refurbish the old Soviet naval base at Tartus, thus resuming Moscow's direct influence in the region for the first time since the late 1980s. Thus, the outbreak of conflict, civil war, and counterterrorism campaigns in Syria took place within the context of a revived Russia modernizing its military and reasserting itself in the region. So, in 2015, stunning the West, Russia launched an expeditionary force into Syria, beginning its first overseas campaign since the days of the Cold War. What prompted such a risky and audacious move? Well, several factors were at play. 1. As the Syrian Civil War heated up, Russia poured material support into the country, but grew increasingly concerned over the fate of its ally, especially after the rise of ISIS. 2. On a related point, with tens of thousands of jihadists fighting across Syria by 2015, Russia's leaders grew increasingly concerned about the influence those fighters might have on Chechen Muslims within Russia's borders, and the possible rise of terrorist activity aimed at the Russian Federation. 3. In 2014, Russia had annexed the Crimea from Ukraine, which we'll discuss in our next video, and was increasingly involved in the fighting in that country. Putin had achieved much that he desired, and at considerably low cost. In 2015, therefore, Putin's government already had a successful military campaign under its belt. Maybe they could repeat that success in Syria. 4. In 2011, Russia had acquiesced to Western intervention against Gaddafi in Libya. The subsequent overthrow of his government and that country's descent into the chaos of civil war made Russia very reticent to allow a similar fate to befall Assad's Syria. 5. The Obama administration, hamstrung by an unhelpful Congress and the legacy of Bush's wars, had no clear or decisive policy in Syria, which left space for others to act if they so chose. Russia officially justified its actions as necessary to support the Syrian government in its fight against terrorism and to, quote, stabilize the legitimate authority of Assad. Putin authorized airstrikes against quote-unquote terrorists in Syria, as in the following clip.
We will support the Syrian army only in its legitimate fight specifically against terrorist groups.
But whatever Putin and his spokespeople might say to the contrary, in order for Russia to bolster Assad's faltering war effort and prevent the defeat of the Syrian army, it would have to attack Syrian opposition forces as well as ISIS and others that the West would consider terrorists. Thus, despite Russia's official line, starting in late September, their airstrikes targeted areas well outside the Islamic State's territory. These airstrikes were the start of Operation Vozmedye, or Retribution, and targeted both moderates, like the Free Syrian Army, and Sunni rebels affiliated with ISIS. Russia's leaders took the opportunity to show off the fruits of their country's decade of military modernization efforts. Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers flew from the base on the Kola Peninsula all the way to the Mediterranean to launch long-range cruise missiles on targets in Syria. By October 2015, Russian ships off the coast of the Mediterranean had also begun firing cruise missiles at targets almost 1,000 miles away. As ISIS flourished and Russia intervened more directly, calls both outside and within the administration rang out for military intervention into Syria. Take, for example, longtime GOP war hawk John McCain, one of these guys that's never met a war he didn't like.
What exactly should the United States do in this? You have repeatedly spoken about ground troops. What exactly do you mean?
Well, exactly on ground troops is about 10,000 Americans with a coalition of other Arab countries, hopefully maybe NATO countries, maybe even France, where we could go in on the ground with sufficient air support to take out ISIS. They are not invincible. They are not unbeatable. But as long as they have this base and this ability, unlike Al-Qaeda, then they're going to be able to orchestrate threats to the United States of America. The second thing we need to do is a robust arming, training, and equipping. The only way you can do that is having a no-fly zone, a buffer zone, where also you could relieve the pressure from the refugee problem so that they would not be barrel-bombed by Bashar Assad, the great butcher in the history of the Middle East.
Look at what John McCain is doing here. He's taking the black and white, Manichaean, good versus evil, classic Cold War mentality of foreign policy and combining it with a post-Cold War, unipolar American liberalism, America as the country with a unique responsibility to act on the global stage kind of mindset. Now, he tries to fudge this a little bit with talk of a coalition, but it's implied and understood by, I think, many in his audience that America is going to shoulder the brunt of this endeavor. And once we're there, we're going to have to go all the way, and it's probably going to take a lot more than 10,000 troops to get this job done. Now, McCain's not stupid. He probably knows this, but this gets the foot in the door to another war that he thinks is necessary. Obama officials did not go so far as their GOP rival, but Secretary of State John Kerry, UN Ambassador Samantha Power, and to some extent CIA Director John Brennan all believed limited military force was better than inaction. But the Pentagon and the President remained unconvinced that conventional U.S. military action, either to destroy ISIS or to support the Syrian opposition, was worth the risk of escalation and blowback. In lieu of invasion, Obama turned to special operations, a hallmark of his post-Bush military doctrine. In November 2015, the Obama administration began the deployment of U.S. Special Forces to Syria, with the mission of assisting rebel forces in their fight against ISIS. He then ordered several dozen special operations troops into Rojava, which is in northern Syria, to assist local fighters battling ISIS there. In doing so, Obama ordered the first open-ended mission by U.S. ground forces into the country. These forces would come to number roughly 500 by the end of 2016. While they certainly contributed to the fighting, and seemed to have a specialty in assassinating ISIS leaders, ultimately such a small number of soldiers did not prove decisive. Other mechanisms were needed. Making a virtue of necessity, U.S. officials tried to work with the Russians. Looked at through the lens of narrow bilateral cooperation, which is how the Russia reset viewed the world, cooperation between Russia and the West seemed like a no-brainer. Both sides had a common enemy, Surely they could work together, as they had with the New START Treaty or the Iranian nuclear deal, to eradicate this nascent terror state. From the US perspective, this policy risked weakening at least some anti-Assad groups that were friendly to the US, granted, but it also held out the prospect of crushing ISIS. The new Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, disagreed with Secretary of State John Kerry that Russian assistance was worth pursuing. He suspected Russian intentions and didn't think the US had a lot to gain in cooperating with them. He also pointed out that the US had put the kibosh on military cooperation with Russia since Putin's 2014 annexation of Crimea. Kerry retorted that the economic sanctions on Russia would remain in place, and also emphasized that the number one concern should be, as he put it, killing the terrorists faster. Ultimately, Obama sided with Kerry, and military cooperation with Russia was pursued. The Kremlin had other ideas, however. Russia, as ever, was not willing to cooperate from what it saw as an inferior position. Russia therefore insisted that the West give up its demand for regime change in Syria. Assad was an ally of Russia. Russia, as we talked about in the first part of this video series, protected its friends. Think of Serbia. And as a great power, Russia's friends should be safe from undue interference from the outside, especially the West. Despite this fundamental difference in perception, an attempt at bilateral cooperation was made by both sides. Between 2015 and 2016, both countries tried to cooperate in brokering ceasefires. On September 10, 2016, for instance, a year after Russia began its Syrian expedition, the United States and Russia signed an agreement aimed at both reducing the violence in Syria and bringing the two nations into closer cooperation in the fight against ISIS. The US and Russia also established the Center for Operational Coordination Against the Islamic State, so that both sides could better coordinate their military campaigns. Alas, this potential turning point, as Secretary Kerry called it, was to no avail. Weeks after the agreement came the news that the Syrian and Russian air forces had pummeled the city of Aleppo, retaking it for Assad. In response, the State Department announced that it was suspending talks with Moscow regarding the ceasefire and shutting down the recently established coordination center. International negotiation efforts at Vienna and later Geneva during this period also failed to produce anything substantial, hampered once again by fundamental differences between the policy objectives of the West, NATO, the US, the EU, and the rest, in this case, Russia and Iran. By 2016, ISIS, which only a few years earlier had appeared to be nearly unstoppable in northern and eastern Syria, had buckled under the weight of simultaneous confrontations with three rival coalitions. 1. Kurdish forces and their U.S. allies. 2. Pro-Assad Syrian forces supported by Iran and Russia. And 3. A Turkish-backed coalition of rebel groups. After 2016, its once vaunted battlefield prowess had all but collapsed. Meanwhile, thanks to the decisive impact of Russian air power and soldiers from Iran and Hezbollah, Assad had regained his footing and seemed on the upswing in the Syrian Civil War. Yet despite these developments, the Hydra-headed conflict continued to hemorrhage the nation well past the end of Obama's presidency. To sum up, the fighting in Syria began as an outgrowth of the Arab Spring protests, with thousands of Syrians protesting and then fighting against the Syrian government. So long as the conflict remained predominantly between rebel groups and Assad, the US under Obama refrained from direct intervention, even after the documented use of chemical weapons by Assad prompted Obama to try and obtain congressional approval to attack Assad. ISIS changed the situation, prompting Obama to provide material assistance to rebels while also engaging US-led forces in airstrikes against ISIS targets in Syria and Iraq. Fearing for their client, Russia augmented its existing support for Assad with soldiers and aircraft. Obama responded both by attempting to cooperate with Russia against ISIS and by sending hundreds of special operators into the country. By the end of Obama's tenure, the initial conflict between citizens and their government had mutated into a three-way slugging match with no end in sight. Syria itself, of course, was left utterly devastated, with thousands dead or wounded and millions made refugee, fleeing into neighboring countries or braving the sea for a chance at safety in Europe. As is so often the case in history, these desperate people were often treated as an invading barbarian horde, even in apparently enlightened Europe. A rightward shift in European politics followed in their wake. As for U.S.-Russia relations, the conflict was another major blow to the bilateral cooperation that had been the goal of Obama's Russia reset. Russia had still been a diplomatic partner of sorts when it came to Assad's chemical weapons, but its UN vetoes, support for Assad, and military expedition to Syria all strained relations with the West. And, unlike the disagreements over missile defense, which only sporadically grabbed news headlines, the disagreements Obama and Putin had over Syria made the nightly news. The reset was breaking down in a very public way. Thanks again for watching the video. Next time, we'll cover events in Ukraine from 2014 to the end of Obama's tenure. As mentioned in this video, Russia's policy there predated its intervention in Syria and influenced their decision-making in the Middle East. Nevertheless, I decided to cover Syria first, as it was the last time that anything resembling bilateral cooperation between the US and Russia took place. Outside of Syria, relations deteriorated considerably. Ukraine was one sore spot. Another, which we'll cover in the 5th video, concerned Russia's role in the 2016 US presidential election. At any rate, remember to like, comment, subscribe, etc. Sources and further reading are in the video description. Hope to see you next time.